Good afternoon and a warm welcome to Researcher's Desk. And it's absolutely super to have Professor Kristoffer Hylander with us today from Stockholm University at the Berlin Center for Climate Research, where Kristoffer has been one of the leaders over many years. We have in fact we worked together in some years together in the Berlin Center. Kristoffer is going to talk with us about coffee management, biodiversity, climate change, focusing on Ethiopia. Kristoffer, we so much appreciate you taking your time to be with us today. I'm going to hand over to you now. I'm going to turn my own camera off. I will be in the background. If there's any technical difficulties, I will suddenly appear. The floor is yours. Welcome to Researcher's Desk.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will start directly with sharing my screen. Starting like this. Now I hope everyone sees my first.
This looks great, Kristoffer.
Yeah,
looks good.
Yeah, thanks so many of you to showing up here, and I will share a little bit of what I've been doing together with a lot of colleagues in Ethiopia. And in the beginning, we worked mostly with biodiversity questions related to coffee management, and towards the last years, we have been starting to look a little bit more on the climate aspect. So I will give you a little bit of overview over several things we have been doing in the last years. So I just start from the beginning here. So the reality for conservation of biodiversity across our planet is that all ecosystems are modified by humans in some way or another. I mean, there are some places that are more like wild and some that are less, but generally landscapes look like this. This is from Google Earth, from a Swedish forest landscape. You have clear cuts, you have small roads, you have places where people have agriculture and etc. Here's an aerial photo or a satellite image from Ethiopia. It looks pretty much similar, right? With some forest areas and some open areas. A mosaic landscape where people live and have their incomes. And we also need to preserve the biodiversity in such landscapes where we as humans live and make our living. So that's a challenge, and I'm interested in this this challenge, how to eat the cake and have the cake still there in different ecosystems. And I've been fortunate to be able to work both in boreal forests, but also in these coffee agroforest systems in Ethiopia, which I will talk about today. So this is just what I have said. The biodiversity conservation needs to be implemented in multifunctional landscapes, in landscapes where also humans are and live. So I've been working in Horn of Africa and in Ethiopia, in southwestern Ethiopia more precisely, for many years now, with a lot of students that have I did own field work in the beginning, but now I'm mostly supervising students, both from Ethiopia and from Stockholm. So if we go to this southwestern part of Ethiopia, there is a mosaic landscape with a lot of small-scale agriculture and some areas that are covered with trees. And if you go into those areas of trees, you find often coffee. And this area is known for its wild coffee. So this picture shows the story that it was a goat and the goat herder that found coffee. And this is Arabica coffee. That's a coffee we mostly drink and value highest of all different coffee species. So coffee is actually growing wild in this landscape, and it's indigenous environment. So this picture of wild coffee shrubs under a canopy of rainforest trees. But of course, it's not easy to say what is really wild and not wild, since people have been managing also this wild coffee since long. But it's apparent that the genetic diversity is highest in this. Of all coffee that you find in the world, the forest coffee of Ethiopia has the highest genetic diversity. So everything speaks to the origin of coffee from these forests. Otherwise, coffee, besides in the forest, it's grown under shade in gardens, and in some places from satellite image it looked like forest. In some places it looked more like plantations. So this is a picture now from January when I was there last time, with the coffees flowering under the albizia and acacia trees. And coffee is also a very important cultural product in Ethiopia. Everyone drinks coffee, and when you come to visit the family, you get the question, do you want some coffee? And they bring green beans and start preparing them, roasting them, cooking water, and so you get freshly brewed coffee often. It takes a while, but the quality is superb. So this is such an example where they also dry the coffee fruits in the yard of the house on the right picture. So when we have been studying here, we have considered this gradient in management intensity in many of our projects. So from forest coffee up to plantation coffee. Sometimes you can have different categories. You read about semi-forest coffee, semi-plantation coffee, etc. Mostly we think of it as a gradient in intensification. This is the picture showing a study by, let's see if I can have something to point with. Now you can see here. So we have 3 different clusters here where we have looked at different type of management of coffee. So the cluster 3 is the more wild, less managed coffee, and cluster 1 is the more heavily managed coffee across these larger forest areas. And as you see on for example, this diagram, the middle one, we can focus on that. So distance to road, you have closer to the roads, you have more heavily managed coffee, and the further you get into the forest, you have less managed coffee. But basically, you have coffee across the whole landscape. And we have interviewed people in these forests on how they manage the coffee. So in this left part of the figure shows different management activities in different months of the year of the more heavily managed coffee system. So here they plant new coffee, they put in extra, plant new coffee in some places, they put in extra seedlings in some places, they do some digging, a lot of slashing of the underground vegetation. While in the less managed coffee, they mostly harvest and they do some kind of weeding, especially at the same time as they harvest when they are there. But most of the years, no one is in those places, and people actually move in and out of the forest also. So there's a kind of movement across the landscape related to the coffee phenology, which is quite interesting. So how do this coffee management affect the biodiversity? So we have done one study on forest birds, and as you see here, the coffee density negatively impacts the number of bird species. So you have a negative relationship. The more coffee you have in the forest, the fewer forest specialists you get. So that indicates that this kind of intensification of coffee management has a negative impact on biodiversity. Of course, if you clear the forests, you get a strong negative effect directly. Sometimes people save this kind of trees out in the agricultural landscape and perhaps start planting coffee under those trees again. So then you can regain some of the forest biodiversity out in the gardens with the help of the coffee. And if you look at in the agriculture landscape, how much coffee you have, that is actually a positive indication of similarity with forests, for example, on trees. So you have this double kind of story where coffee in the agriculture landscape is positive for biodiversity, and coffee in the forest, if it's starting to intensify, then the coffee density in the forest will be negative for the biodiversity. And this make it quite complex, for example, if you want to make coffee certification in these landscapes. And I'm always proposing to certify maybe the whole landscape instead of every single site, because every single site, then you have this difficulty. Sometimes it's strongly positive and sometimes it's very negative. So I had the opportunity to do field work myself. So here I'm climbing one of the trees to look at the biodiversity, the epiphytes up in the trees. So basically you have small gardens with orchids, ferns, and bryophytes high up in the trees. And it's an important part of the biodiversity of plant biodiversity in tropical systems, the epiphytes. And they're a bit difficult to reach, as you see from this picture. We have studied also this gradient where we have measured coffee yields. So on the x-axis, if we start looking at the left upper picture here, you see the average coffee yield here. So you see from very, very low yields to high yields. And on the y-axis is a kind of community composition, meaning that points with high values here, they are more forest-like community composition of trees, and values that are low are very little similar to forests. And as you see here, we have a strong decline in the beginning, meaning that when people start to intensify forest management or coffee management in the forests, you get a strong decline in typical forest biodiversity. While from say 1,000 kilo per hectare up to 2,500, that kind of difference in yield doesn't really reflect any change in species composition of forest trees, which means that there is an opportunity in these more high yielding places to actually look for win-win solutions. Where can we improve? So these points, for example, that are above this red line. We haven't gone into details on this yet, but that's something that I would like to do. So what are the typical management? How do people do to have this very nice high biodiversity forest-like sites while still being able to produce high yields? And similar curves are for herbaceous species like orchids and etc. And bryophytes show also a similar pattern. So in general, we have this diversity yield trade-off where we have the same drivers in this part of the curve for decline in biodiversity and increase in yields. So it's really difficult to find any win-win possibilities here. As soon as you start to intensify and try to get higher yields, you will lose biodiversity. In this area, on the other hand, there are different drivers for decline in biodiversity and increase in yields. So here there is a possibility to learn more and to develop management and biodiversity. Still, of course, these areas will never be able to have the true wild forest biodiversity, but still there is a lot of possibilities in this area. So we are right now writing a paper where we put together a lot of different aspects of this coffee system in Ethiopia and trying to understand a little bit more on what actually are driving the yields and what are driving the biodiversity, and can we find some way to in part of the landscape to better give advice of how to get better yields and higher biodiversity at the same time. Here you can have a direct effect also between the biodiversity and the yield, both the positive and negative aspects of, sometimes we call them ecosystem services and ecosystem disservices. So one ecosystem service that we have been interested in is different kind of natural pest control, because we know that birds can eat larvae of things that eat on the coffee, spiders as well, ants as well, and we have the parasitoids, which are small insects that lay egg in another insect that could also be important top-down controller. So we have, I mean, the biodiversity is so large and so many different things are going on in parallel, so it's difficult to get the full picture. But we have done a few things that are interesting, I think. So, for example, regarding parasitoids, we have seen that in the more complex forest systems, forest coffee, semi-forest coffee, semi-plantation coffee, with more biodiversity and more trees, we have a much higher parasitism rate than in the more commercial plantation, meaning that there is natural pushing down the pests in these more natural systems. So that is a good opportunity to make use of the biodiversity from the coffee management perspective. We have also studied a hyperparasite. So we have this yellow parasite that is called coffee rust, that is a big pest and disease on coffee. But then we have a hyperparasite, which is a white fungus that eats the red fungus. And if we have a lot of the amount of hyperparasite, if that increases, that pushes down the growth of the pathogen of the rust. So if we can find some way to enhance the biology or the environment for the hyperparasite, that would be good also as a top-down control. My final example is from ants. So we have trees with ants that are nesting high up in the tree, and they are climbing down the tree and onto the coffee shrubs surrounding that tree. And they are eating the larvae that eat the coffee. So they suppress the herbivory level. These are quite close distances, only like 5 meters from the trees. So when we are 10 meters away, we don't see any effects. So the question is, how important is this at the whole ecosystem level and for the yield? That we don't know. So let's look a bit into the climate aspect and what's going on there. So coffee is a special plant. I guess all plants are special, but in terms of its relation to climate, it can't grow at the highest altitudes because then it becomes too cold. So in Ethiopia, in this area where we are working, it has its upper limit around 2,000 meters above sea level. And in the lower limit, around 1,200, 300 or something. And then below that, it becomes too hot. And below 2,000, it becomes too cold. It also needs a very special rainfall pattern. So it flowers during the dry season when it seldom is raining, but it needs like 2 days of heavy rain. And then it starts to flower and flower for just like 2 or 3 days. And then the fruits start to develop, and then some new buds are starting to develop, and then a second rain event make a second flowering event. So you also get the fruits, they are in different stages, which make it difficult to harvest because they could be differently ripe. So it has both its relation to temperature and relation to precipitation that is a bit special and make it also vulnerable for changes in the climate. So we have been putting out loggers in 60 sites to measure the temperature and also soil air moisture over several years in a management gradient. And here you see a picture on this rust this orange rust, and you see the hyperparasite with the white spores here. And one of our students, so I should say I'm closely working together with Professor Aiko Tak, which is a colleague here at our Department of Ecology, Environment and Plant Science. So he and me, we have several projects together, and sometimes I am the PI, principal investigator, and sometimes he is the one who is the supervisor of the students. So some of the things that I will talk about now is mainly led by Aiko and his PhD students, but I'm also have been heavily involved also in all of it. So this is done by a person called Brook Ayalo, who defended his thesis just half a year ago. So this is a very complex figure, but I will walk you through a few pieces. So if we look at the left figure and the blue circle here, we have looked at the coffee rust severity here. And that is driven by the maximum temperature. So in those places that have high maximum temperature, the warm places in the landscape, they have more problems with rust. But the canopy cover, if you have high canopy cover, that reduces the maximum temperature. So you could buffer the maximum temperature by having denser canopy cover, more trees in your coffee site. And then indirectly, you will get lower rust problems. For the hyperparasite, it doesn't seem like the maximum temperature is driving it, but instead the minimum temperature. So the hyperparasites seem to like a bit colder places on higher elevations in the landscape. And we didn't really see how the canopy cover is influencing this. So it's more the topography that is influencing this. So, but if we can find a way that we enhance the hyperparasite, the environment for that one, and decrease the environmental for the rust, we can perhaps get more top-down control and less problems for the farmers. What is going on in some part of this landscape and has been going on for some time is logging and conversion of the forest to agriculture. So this is one example. You walk in the landscape and you see there is a new field with they have planted some grain and they have cut down most of the trees. The biggest trees, someone has put on fire in the base to kill it so that it would not shade so much and eventually it will fall. So we have been looking at zooming out a bit to see where is this deforestation going on and where is the reforestation going on. So all the red here is deforestation between 73 and 2010. And the blue is new shades and afforestation or reforestation. And as you see, there's more red than blue, which is unfortunate. But what is very interesting is to see where this red is located in terms of its elevation. So most of the deforestation is this y-axis here is the elevation, goes from 1400 meter to 3000 meter. And you see that most of the deforestation is going on at the high altitudes and less deforestation at the altitudes where actually coffee has its peak abundance. So in this sense, it seems like coffee agriculture or coffee management in this landscape is really protecting the tree cover in the landscape and protecting the forests even, I would say. So above the coffee, where coffee can grow, the balance between ecosystem services and these services make farmer to decide to cut down the forest because they have problems with animals like baboons and pigs coming from the forest out to the agricultural landscape. But when coffee can grow in the forest, suddenly the balance shifts back and you get a positive effect of the forest because you can harvest coffee from there. You have to deal with the animals, but you have so much positive that it outweighs the negative effects. I'll come back to that in the summary. So more on the climate, that we have used these loggers that I told about that measure temperature once an hour or every third hour. So we have put out these loggers, and then we had a postdoc in the group, Francisco Signol. He's now in Umeå, and he collected data. He used our collected data to produce microclimate models for this part of Ethiopia. And to do the models, we used vegetation layers from satellite images and topography from digital elevation models to produce this kind of models. So this is just an example of the variation over the year. The colors here you don't need to bother about, but so you have warmer in the Swedish. So it's warmer here when it's spring here, and when it's cold in the northern hemisphere, because it's more sunny. And then it gets colder in the rainy season when it's more cloudy. So you see it varies from 20 degrees, the maximum temperatures, to 30 degrees. But you see that there is also a lot of variability. So, and we're interested in this variability between sites and how that could be explained. And we explain it with vegetation, with canopy cover, with topography, and many different things. And then Francisco, he has produced these future predictions. So this is the reference period in June and the variability between different sites. So you see here you have much colder places compared to in this part of the area, for example. In October, when it's more sunny and less cloudy, you have even warmer temperatures in this part of the landscape compared to here. And then when we see on the future predictions, we see increases in temperatures as is predicted for most parts of the world. But we also see some small scale variability here that is interesting and related to shade cover and these kind of things that could then be linked back to adaptations of coffee management, in terms of if it's possible to create a buffering environment that is buffering enough or not, and if farmers need to shift to other crops, or if they could adapt to the new conditions, and these kind of things. So we have been now also the last years starting to interview farmers about their perceptions of climate change, and if there is analyzing if there is a spatial variability in the perceptions of climate change, and what kind of adaptation practices they are using, and comparing with climate data. So just recently there is a paper published by a master student, Xenia, in Ambio, where she compared the climate data with the interview data that Brooke collected. And this is just a picture of another of my students, who is right now in Ethiopia interviewing farmers on their natural resource use. His name is Obsu Hirko. So this is a picture from Xenia's paper, showing that actually the data says that the temperature the mean temperature in this landscape is increasing. And when we ask the farmers of their perceptions, actually a large proportion also feel that it is increasing, compared to those a few that say that it is decreasing. Some are saying that there is no change in general, but it's a change in extremes. In terms of the precipitation, over the long term, it seems like a decrease. Over the last 30 years, that trend is now not visible in the data. When we ask people, there is a little bit more mixed answers, and quite a lot of people are concerned about the change in timing. And then more people are saying decreasing than increase, but a bit less strong pattern that is similar. When we look at the distribution of how the farmers in the landscape answer these things, it seems like those that are in those places that are the driest and the warmest now, those have more likelihood of saying that it's actually increasing and getting drier compared to those farmers that are in places where it's the wetter part of the landscape. And perhaps it's intuitive that it's like that, but I mean, it could have been the other way around also, if you have this thresholds on when coffee can grow and not can grow. So, but this is the pattern that we find. We have also one student working on the upper limit of coffee, where it's traditionally hasn't been grown. So the upper elevational border. So he's interviewing people and farmers here, and he's also doing he's recording what kind of plants and what kind of trees people are planting there, and to what extent they are actually starting to plant coffee. And actually what he is finding is that there is starting to become an increased tree cover at higher elevations. So there is an upslope movement of coffee and shade trees, and this will create an opportunity to restore some of these landscapes that have very few trees, and some of the biodiversity associated with trees will perhaps come back to this landscape as an effect of the climate change, and that farmers react to that climate change to diversify their income possibilities in these parts of the landscape. We have been starting also to work a little bit at the lower end of the coffee gradient, but in our landscape we are not really at the rear edge, but we are looking in these places and we are asking people, and we are also seeing that people are complaining and having troubles with drought to some extent here, and are thinking of perhaps changing to other crop species in this part of the landscape. So to sum up, I've talked a lot now about many different things, but coffee is a key player for biodiversity and livelihood in Ethiopia, and if something is affecting coffee, it will affect a lot of other things. The tree cover, and then the biodiversity, and the income of people, and the way they live, and etc. And coffee protects the forest from being clear-cut and improve variability that enhance biodiversity in the agricultural landscape. So it has a really, really positive effect in many ways. But it's difficult to intensify forest coffee to improve yields without losing unique forest biodiversity. So at the same time as coffee is protecting the forest cover, it's also degrading those forests that are still there. And if the true old growth and wild biodiversity of those forests should be protected, we need to do something, find some kind of balance here. The climate warming will create opportunities for reforestation at higher altitudes, but also will pose challenges to farmers at lower altitudes to cope and adapt, both directly and indirectly with different pests. For example, rust, that we have seen that it likes a bit warmer climate. So in this presentation, I have also listed a few of the papers that deals with biodiversity and coffee biodiversity and climate. So that's something that you can find on my homepage also, if you want to read more about that. So I put maybe this one back, and then I say thank you, and I'm happy to take questions. And
thank you so much, Kristoffer, for a really educational talk with an awful lot of insight for us. We're looking forward to some questions, so I'll turn off the recording.